Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Missions Extra. I'm joined today by Pastor Ben Morrison. Ben shared the message for us this past Sunday. Now, we usually do a sermon extra, but this week we're going to combine our sermon extra and our missions extra. And I'm going to have Ben just kind of share with us a little bit about his ministry and about his story of how he got into being a missionary in Ukraine. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube page. Just click that button to subscribe. If you click the notification button, you'll get notified whenever we post any new content. And of course, check us out. This is also podcasted. So if you're a podcast listener, make sure to go over and subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you prefer. We're on all the main ones: Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, all those good places. But wherever you listen, you'll be able to find us. Make sure you subscribe. And if you'd leave us a rating, that would really help to help other people find this gospel-centered content that we're trying to put out, answering people's questions, really inspiring people, in this case, inspiring people to step into what God has for them in their lives in regard to engaging in his mission and being part of it. It's a big part of our ethos as a church, and we support many missionaries. Ben's one of them. So Ben is great. We've known each other. How long have we known each other?
When did you move back from Hungary?
I moved to Colorado in 2012. But I actually know when we first met.
2009 maybe, or
2009,
10?
10.
Yeah.
That's right. So I was in Hungary, you were in Ukraine, and we met at different things, different conferences and stuff like that, and had a lot in common.
Indeed.
And, same heart for the Lord and same heart for the mission of God. And so it's been good partnering. You've spoken over here, I've spoken over there. And so Ben, maybe you could tell our viewers who don't know you, like I do, about your ministry, just kind of in a nutshell. What is it that you do? I know you have a couple things you're involved in, so go ahead.
Right, yeah. First and foremost, I'm a church planner, lead pastor of Calvary Chapel, Svitlovodsk, which is a smaller town in central Ukraine. I've been there for 16 years now, in Ukraine total for almost 20 at this point. So we moved there, planted a church. I'm still the lead pastor of that church. Besides that, for the last 4 or so years, I've been the coordinator of a ministry called City to City Ukraine. City to City it's an affiliate of Redeemer City to City, which was started by Tim Keller to help see church planting movements in key cities throughout the world. So that's been going since 2016. We offer various training, coaching across a broad network of evangelical leaders to see new churches planted in the key cities of Ukraine. We have sort of a vision and a dream that we're working towards, which is to see 100 new churches planted by 2030 in the key cities of Ukraine. So by God's grace, we're on our way towards that. Already training now the third group of church planners, which will bring us up to 30. So that would be one thing. And then kind of partially together with that, I also serve as the training coordinator for City to City Europe. So kind of doing the same thing, but on the continent-wide level to see movements of the gospel in the key cities of Europe.
Cool. Well, Ben, maybe tell us a little bit about how you came to be a missionary in Ukraine. I mean, how does one become a missionary? I know how I became a missionary, but again, this is for our viewers and listeners who are thinking, how does somebody, where are you from? What took place in your life that got you to this point?
Right. So I started my journey of missions. I was going to Bible college in my basically home city of Indianapolis. Part of the program was that we had a missions practicum at the end of each academic year, and we didn't choose where we went. So the first year, we actually went to Nicaragua. And I ended up staying longer than the rest of the group. I stayed for the whole summer, really just fell in love with it, just kind of the whole cross-cultural missions thing. I was ready to not move back, at 18 years old or whatever it was. But kind of was convinced through talking with my parents, my Bible college director, to come back, finish Bible college first. So the second year we went to Ukraine. And it was sort of the same thing where I ended up staying for the whole summer, really just loved it, fell in love with the culture, particularly at that point in Ukraine's history. Kind of it was still riding the wave of post-Soviet, people's just really impressive openness to the gospel in my mind. So that was certainly attractive. And so long story short, I came back. I had one semester left of Bible college after that, and I was there. I stayed that summer with one other guy. Stayed for a longer time as well with me, one of my good friends. And when we came back, I only had a semester of Bible college left, and he would ask, he's like, so what are you going to do after this? And he knew that my heart was for missions. And I'm like, I don't know, I'm praying, and he would ask, so what if you didn't have to pray? What would you do? And I was like, I'd go to Ukraine. He's like, then don't pray, just go. I was like, thank you for that very spiritual advice.
It's kind of weird advice, but
yeah. So a little bit later, this is really getting up towards, the point of graduation, November, I believe it was. We had sort of a prayer, praise and worship evening for the college age ministry there at our church. And really just felt the Lord impress on my heart that, I needed to, decide what's next, because the fact that I didn't know was really distracting me from what I had in front of me. So I was kind of open and, said, all right, Lord, where am I going? What's the direction? And really felt released that, any of these options, because I had invitations to kind of come back to Nicaragua, to come back to Ukraine, and then I was also involved at the time with both the college ministry and high school ministry in my church in Indianapolis, really to kind of go in any one of those directions, and the Lord would bless it. And so at that point, what my friend, would say, like, if it was up to you, basically, right, what would you choose? And I knew that it was Ukraine, so I'm like, all right, Lord, if it's up to me, then it's Ukraine. And then after that, there was various ways that God kind of began confirming that was really, his direction. So that was November. Finished up Bible college and moved to Ukraine in January of 2002, and have not moved back since. So coming up on 20 years now.
Yeah, I moved to Hungary the same month.
Right, yeah, we had a lot of those little weird idiosyncrasies in common. Yeah.
What's funny about that, the whole idea of just kind of like, it's something that people have said before, and I think there's a degree of validity to it. Because, so the saying is like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then do whatever you want. And of course, that is meant to be a punchy statement.
Right.
But the idea is that if you're loving the Lord, He's going to be putting His desires into your heart and leading you. And what you want will be to glorify God. Yeah. And in many cases, God's going to direct you through that. I think that's a really, really important principle.
Yeah, sure.
On the other hand, it's funny. For me personally, I have family. My family's from Ukraine, and my mom's side. And so if it was me and if you didn't have to pray and you could just go somewhere, where would you go? I would have said Ukraine too. This is the irony. I wanted to go to Ukraine. And the doors all kind of closed, but there was this amazing open door in Hungary.
Right.
And so I moved to Hungary with this thought, okay, I'm going to move to Hungary, and then
sneak across the border.
Someday I'm going to work my way over to where I really want to be, which is in Ukraine. But then that was just God's way of getting me to Hungary.
Right,
because, of course, I was so happy there and so great, like very meaningful ministry. All that to say, I want to touch on one thing you said, just that there was an amazing openness at that time. Mm-hmm. I mean, we could talk about what it's like now, but I can also say that this is what I always tell people about Eastern Europe particularly, but I'd say uniquely Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine. Maybe there's other places too, but I know those places. And that there's still an incredible openness. That, we often hear all this stuff about how Christianity's dying in Europe. That's a skewed version of the story. It's not the whole information. Yeah. Because Europe is not just like monolithic. Like,
definitely not.
There's different countries, even within countries, different regions that are having whole different things. And you also have different age groups. Mm-hmm. And you have the historical churches versus new movements. And I just think I told someone this earlier this weekend today, that the situation in Eastern Europe is very much harvest is plentiful, workers are few situation. Like you're saying, hey, to plant 100 churches, I think you guys are going to need some church planters. And I know that you're involved in training them. Right. My point is, we need workers. And you guys, I'm looking at you now, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send workers into his mission field. And you know what? I would even challenge you to pray about, maybe it's you, or maybe you're going to be involved in some meaningful way. George Markey, common friend of ours, also a missionary we support. He told me something that it's in my mind all the time. He said, the only thing hindering us from planting churches in Ukraine is we don't have enough church planters. We could plant as many churches as we want, and we just don't have the people. So pray to the Lord of the harvest to send workers into the mission field. I think there's still an incredible openness.
Yeah, sure. I would agree with that. And like you said, Europe is not a monolith. I think when people think about, post-Christian Europe, a lot of that goes back to the historic Protestant churches, right? That are, maybe to some extent similar with like some of the mainline churches, right, here in the U.S., where there is a steep decline in growth. But then you have other churches that are, solidly gospel-centered, evangelical, not in any political sense of that term, but, doctrinally. And a lot of these are actually growing.
Yeah.
With Eastern Europe, which you've mentioned, I think it's interesting because, very different than Northern and Western Europe. Eastern Europe is not, it is in a sense perhaps post-Christian, but it's also post-atheist. Right, because it was under the Soviet Union or satellites of the Soviet Union for 70 plus years. So it's interesting in Christian countries, you'll find, historically Christian countries, right? You'll find lots of nominal Christians who kind of say like, well, I was born here, I guess I'm kind of a Christian, but it doesn't mean a lot. In Ukraine, at least, and, a lot of the former Soviet Union anyway, you'll find nominal atheists who say, well, this is what I was raised under, right? That's, whatever the default worldview is,
yes.
You're always going to find a lot of nominal adherence to that worldview. Yeah. So, you'll find people of the older generation, like my in-laws, my wife is Ukrainian, so like my in-laws, my father-in-law once said, I might be an atheist, but I'm an Eastern Orthodox atheist. Yeah. So like, it's like, well, I'm an atheist, but I pray from time to time. Yeah. So it is an interesting kind of milieu.
Yeah, to me, because Hungary had a lot of similar communist influences, really, trying to promote atheism.
Right.
And so that's what I always tell people is really different over there, is that the older generation are the atheists, and the younger generation are much more open to not only theism, but even Christianity.
Sure.
And I always found this to be really interesting. The whole dynamic is different. Whereas here we think, it's those darn kids getting into that atheism.
Right.
And
that's a little more similar towards like kind of Northern Europe and, further Western Europe that has never come under like this strong ideology of, communism, atheism.
You know what? This is one thing I remember though in Hungary is that you'd meet a lot of these people, and like you're saying, Eastern Orthodox atheist. I'd meet a lot of people who were atheists. It's like they had been trained to be atheists in practice, but not necessarily in their heart. And they would even refer to themselves as materialists. I'm like, can you hear the words coming out of your mouth? You're just saying materialist, like it's like a great thing, and that's actually what they were taught, is that this is what it means to be an atheist. You're a materialist, meaning this material world is all you care about.
Right.
But in many of them, I think when you get into existential conversations, I found that like you're saying, nominal atheists, these people aren't, their hearts aren't in it in many cases.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, that's simply because that worldview just can't provide the answers that really all humans end up asking, which is, origin, meaning, ultimate destination. It's like there's really not a lot of answers within the atheist worldview, materialistic worldview. Best case scenario, you kind of come up with your own, but you sort of know that it's just something you've made up.
Man.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's related to my next question, which is, tell us about some of the challenges you face uniquely in Ukraine. What are some of the challenges to preaching the gospel, pastoring a church, et cetera, that are unique to that place?
Right. I mean, I guess I would say as far as unique, at least in contrast with, North America, the Eastern Orthodox background, which again, something like 70% of Ukrainians would identify themselves as Eastern Orthodox, and then maybe another 9 or 10% as what they call Greek Catholic. So it's Eastern Rite Catholic, which has some differences, but there's a lot of similarities. So that's an overwhelming majority of the population. So that can actually be both a help and a hindrance, despite the fact that you are starting to run into a lot of kind of, sort of post-atheist and then also post-Christian mindset among like the young generation. Nevertheless, there's a lot of people that still sort of at least hold these basic building blocks of, there is a God. There is some kind of, the law of God. Now, they might not be clear on what that is, but there's some understanding of judgment, right? Ultimate judgment. There's a concept of forgiveness. I mean, even let's say on Easter, everybody, to the man, to the woman, everybody on Easter, greets one another, Christ is risen. And the answer is he is risen indeed. I mean, here that used to be standard practice. Now you'll find some people who do it. Even sometimes you'll find Christians that don't really do it. But it's like that's just part of the cultural ingrained thing. So because it's part of the cultural fabric, it can sometimes lead to these open doors for conversations like, well, Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. Well, is he risen indeed? Like, why are you saying that? And what does it mean?
Yeah.
At the same time, it can also be a hindrance because, and this I find more with the older generation that would call themselves Christians, not the atheist ones, that would basically respond like, I already have my church, and it's very much kind of it's all woven into the national identity and kind of well, I can't even consider a slightly different approach to Christianity or a different understanding of the Bible because it would be a betrayal of not my faith per se, but it would be a betrayal of my ancestors, of my cultural heritage. So that can be a hindrance as well.
Yeah. Did they do that during communism?
I mean, I wasn't there under communism,
Sure.
so it's hard for me to say. Obviously, under communism, there were different periods. So in the very beginning, there was a sort of an idea of like a little bit of freedom in that respect. But then really, especially under Stalin, I mean, it became very, harsh persecution, thousands of, priests and clergy sent to gulags and whatnot. After Stalin's days, it kind of started progressively, bit by bit, to get, less oppressive, where then towards the end of the Soviet Union, you already had officially not only the Eastern Orthodox Church was allowed, but also they allowed Protestants, which, despite most people seeing that as sort of a cult, nevertheless, they allowed, I think under pressure from U.S. politicians, allowed like one Protestant denomination, which was the Baptist denomination.
Yeah.
And so really, despite what other flavors of Christianity people believed, if they were Protestant, they were Baptist, because that's the only one that was allowed. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, then things started to sort of break off into more disparate groups. So yeah.
I know that in Hungary, and I know that actually in some cases these Hungarian things were actually direct translations of Russian communist things. And what I mean by that is they would basically take the cultural Christian things and then try to rebrand them with a communist thing. So instead of St. Nicholas, you have... what is in
Grandfather Frost?
Grandfather Frost. In Hungarian, he's called Father Winter.
Okay.
But there are a bunch of those. So in Hungary, we had this guy who was a founder of Hungary, and he's actually a Catholic saint. His name's Saint Stephen. Actually, I'm not sure that he's actually a Catholic saint. I'd have to check in that. Maybe he is. Maybe our listeners
I don't know. Somebody can comment.
But, sometimes we refer to people as saints, and they're not actually Catholic saints.
Okay.
In this case, we refer to this guy as Saint Istvan or Stephen.
Right.
And he has this day, which is like the founding of the country, but the founding of the country as a Christian nation, which took place in 1001 AD. But under communism, they tried to change that holiday, and they changed it into this holiday of like new bread, and it had something to do with like, the workers and the peasants doing this harvest thing.
Yeah.
And they tried to basically downplay any of the cultural Christian things.
Yeah.
And sometimes replace them with like a communist version,
Right.
which in my opinion tells you that there's a very religious undertone to the communism that existed in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, that's fair. And it's actually a fascinating case study, I think. At least in the Soviet Union, one example is Christmas. So, they wanted to obliterate Christmas basically because it's a Christian holiday, right? Birth of Christ and all that. So the first attempt, they said, we're just going to cancel it. Like no Christmas. That didn't fly so well, right? Because people, they want their holiday and, again, the religious undertones. And so what they ended up doing, and this was actually pretty shrewd on the part of the, Soviet higher-ups, was they ended up kind of shifting all of these things to New Year's. Mm-hmm. So to this day, and this remains to this day, despite the fact that the Soviet Union is over, we don't have a Christmas tree, we have a New Year's tree. Yeah. Right? People don't give Christmas gifts, they give New Year's gifts. Yeah. So basically what they did was they took all of the things, but they shifted it. They kind of, if you will, they contextualized their atheism to people's, religious undercurrents, which is actually a fascinating study because it's presenting their worldview, but in a form that people can accept. Yeah. Right. On that which we could go off on that, I guess.
Well, on that note, just maybe say a few words, because as a missionary, you have to learn to contextualize. Now, some people, when they hear that word contextualization, maybe some of our watchers, listeners are like, I'm not 100% sure on what you're talking about. Right. Others of them are like, red flag, and they're like, uh-oh, you're changing Christianity, and that's bad. So what is contextualization? What would you say to those who are concerned that maybe it's something to be concerned about? Sure. So explain for those who aren't 100% sure what it is, and maybe also for those who might have a concern because they're not exactly sure what you mean.
Yeah. So I'll actually use, from Eastern European history, an interesting example of this. So just quickly to define contextualization, we could say that it's, communicating the worldview, in this case Christianity, in your context, in a way that is understandable, palatable, not in the sense that it just kind of, kowtows to everything in the culture, but that it at least resonates with certain narratives in the culture to communicate your worldview. So again, back to historically, Ukraine was officially Christianized a little bit before Hungary, so I believe it was 988 AD. But even before that, there was these two saints, Kirill and Methodius, right? So they're most well known for coming up with the Cyrillic from Kirill's name alphabet, because before that the Slavic peoples didn't have a written alphabet. They were missionaries who were going to the Slavic peoples there and wanted to be able to communicate. The gospel, wanted to be able to communicate the Bible, but they realized these people aren't going to understand Latin. I mean, the Slavic language wasn't even Latin based. And this was at a point, again, before any church split. So there was only one church, right? And Rome was kind of the center at that time. Well, Rome had already said long before that, we don't translate the Bible. The Bible is only in Latin. That's it. But Kirill and Methodius actually went to the Pope to get permission to translate the Bible into, this language that they'd created, really, from the spoken language, obviously, of the Slavic peoples, so that the Bible could be translated into this language. And once they did that, they were able to, really proliferate the gospel. So in one sense, you could actually say contextualization is really just translation. It's not changing the essence of the message. It's changing, the ways that you communicate it so that people can understand it. Ultimately, the scriptural example you could say is in the end found in Christ himself, right? So the Word became flesh, right? That was way beyond our ability to comprehend, but Christ, in his infinite love and compassion, brought it down to a level we could understand. So that's really what contextualization is bringing the eternal gospel, not changing the essence in any way, but bringing it into flesh, into a language that the context can understand.
To put this in a terminology that our listeners can understand.
Yeah. Okay.
Could we say that we're putting the cookies on the shelf where the kids can reach them?
You really could say that.
Yeah. That sounds like something I would say.
It does.
Yeah.
And you just said it.
I know. I said it to you earlier this week.
Yeah.
Ben, tell us about some of the needs that you have as a church and ministry there that our watchers and listeners can be praying for and thinking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess there's a handful of needs I could mention. So one would be I don't remember if I mentioned in the beginning or not. So we've recently just sent out my associate pastor to plant a new church, which we're excited about. At the same time, praying that the Lord would raise up new leaders, bring along, another associate pastor. So could certainly pray for that. We have been in the process of a building project for our church for the last 5 years. God has been faithful and, has in part used your church, Nick, Whitefield's, to generously be part of that. So we've actually been able to bring the building to a point where we've moved in now. We're using the new facility, but there's still a lot left to do. So could certainly pray that God would continue providing for that need. As I mentioned with City to City, we have this goal of seeing 100, gospel-centered churches planted by 2030. So certainly, again, that's not going to happen unless it's the work of God's Spirit. So, just pray for that. Pray for the right planters to be raised up, to be connected with us. The necessary, support for them would be there. I guess that would be a handful of prayer requests.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Hey, one kind of last question. What would you say? What advice would you give to somebody watching this video or listening to this podcast right now? And they're thinking, I want to be involved in the mission of God in the world. I don't know does that mean I have to move across the world and, read an alphabet that looks weird to me? Does it mean that I need to do something radical? Like, what does it mean? Like, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to be involved and they aren't quite sure how to get started?
Yeah, great question. I guess I would say, first of all, there's a difference between what at least recent historically has been defined as mission and missions, plural, which this is a missions extra, as I've learned. So mission, singular, sometimes is used to refer overall to God's mission in the world, right? His saving mission to bring a people to himself through Jesus Christ, to ultimately to redeem all of creation, to restore, to unite under Christ's lordship. So that mission is everywhere and anywhere. I mean, that, you don't have to think about like, well, if I'm not moving to another continent, then I'm not part of God's mission. No, you're part of God's mission here and now, wherever you are, your workplace, your neighborhood, and God wants to use you in that place. And really, I would say even before somebody starts considering like foreign field missions, if you're not part of God's mission where you are now, you're probably not going to be part of God's mission anywhere else.
Ben,
you gotta use the doors that are open in front of you.
Are you telling me that buying an airplane ticket is not going to change my heart?
I know that's shocking.
Yeah.
I know that's shocking.
I remember talking to somebody once.
Yeah.
And they were saying, as soon as I get to India, man, my devotional life's going to be better. I'm just going to be so dialed in to like sharing my faith. I'm like, but you not doing those things. What do you think that geography is going to change that? If anything, it might make it harder.
Yeah, but there is maybe a slight bit of truth to the fact that throwing yourself into a situation like that, Tim Keller actually says this, that being in full-time ministry will either make you a much better Christian or a much worse Christian. That either because you will find yourself desperate for, something that only God can do, it will actually, in a sense, it will drive you, right, to cast yourself on Christ, to maybe pray more than you had been. At the same time, if it could also make you much worse Christian, right? If you're not actually doing it in the first place, there will be a great temptation to simply play the part. And you just end up kind of a hypocrite with this, you've got a public exterior, but then nothing else behind that. But back to, kind of how do you figure out, what is God calling you to? How do I get involved not only in mission in general, but missions, perhaps meaning cross-cultural missions specifically? which really there is an emphasis in that in the Great Commission. Jesus doesn't just say, go preach the gospel. He says, go into all the world and preach the gospel, right, to the ends of the earth. So there is also that global aspect to what God calls us to. John Newton, who was a minister who wrote Amazing Grace, I think most people would know that song. He wrote a pastoral letter to a young man, a response, who this young man asked him, well, how do I know what God is calling me to? How can I be sure? He was considering full-time ministry. And Newton basically answered that there's really kind of three things that more or less would comprise God's call. And to summarize those in a memorable way, you could say it's affinity, ability, and opportunity, which he didn't use those exact words in the letter. But affinity meaning your desire, right? Where is your heart at? And that's kind of, with my friend who's like, well, if you didn't have to pray, what would you want to do? So there is, a very real aspect of that. But Newton warns in the letter, and this is actually kind of what you were mentioning, Nick, that if your greatest desire is not Christ himself, that's dangerous. You can't just say, what do I want to do? Because if Christ isn't the highest desire, your desires are not going to be shaped by him, and you're going to end up going the wrong way. So this is not the Disney movie philosophy of follow your heart, right? That's not what we're saying. We're saying follow Christ, delight in Christ, and then stop to see, okay, after that, what are the desires of my heart, right? Psalm, I believe it's 37, the psalmist says, delight yourself in the Lord, and then he'll give you the desires of your heart, right? But there's that first part first. The second aspect would be ability, right? So what has God gifted you to? What is he, what really works for you? And Newton in his letter warns, don't just look at, what you can do now, but also there's the aspect of, develop whatever he's given you. So it might be that right now you don't have tons of ability, but you have, maybe some natural inclinations in areas, develop that, right? Do your all to develop those things and see where God takes it. The last point being opportunity, right? Where are the doors open? And, to use your example, Nick, this is kind of like what you were saying. You had a desire maybe to go to Ukraine. And so you got to Hungary, but it's like all the doors were closed. And so kind of you took the cue that maybe God is actually directing you in a slightly, into a neighboring country, right, to a slightly different place, and Newton also actually warns in his letter, test doors, check to see if they're open. If you just sit on the couch and you're not checking the doors, you're never going to know which ones are open. Right. Somebody has used the analogy of like it's much easier to steer a car when it's moving, right? To turn a ship when it's moving. There's various, ship, yeah. Yeah, I've heard various, variations on it, rather than when it's sitting still. So it's kind of like go test the waters. Take a short-term mission trip, check it out. You're not going to know unless you get out there and start doing things. At the same time, Newton warns: don't bust the door down. Basically, right? Don't just kind of go against every bit of common sense and like push your way through because that's what you want to do. Yeah. So I guess, kind of those 3 points, I have found that to be helpful, and I've shared that, with a number of people, when we have church planners looking at joining our training with City to City, it's like, that's one of the first things that we actually talk to them about is those 3 points.
That's really good. Really helpful. Well, Ben, God bless you, and God bless your ministry over there.
Thank you.
And guys, be praying for Ben, for his ministry with City to City and Calvary Chapel, Svitlovodsk. Be praying about these things in regard to your own life and what it looks like for you to be meaningfully engaged in God's mission. So until next time, remember to like, subscribe, do all those good things, and we'll be with you again soon. God bless.